This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so today we'll talk about manage basis total, right? Now we already discussed what is manage basis total. So manage basis total functionality basically allows us to configure a compensation basis wherein we manage employees' total compensation using the top-down approach, right? As I mentioned, in a top-down approach, I would basically define the total compensation that the employee would be getting. For example, let's say the total CTC of a given employee is 100,000 rupees, right? Now, once the total compensation is defined, the system automatically distributes this total compensation among all the subordinate plans which are assigned to the worker, right? So for example, if I look at this example wherein the employee's total CTC is some 100,000, he has multiple plans assigned. For example, he has a travel allowance, which is a fixed amount allowance, 1,000 rupees per month. Now system takes 12,000 out of this 100,000 and assigns it to travel allowance, right? Similarly, takes mobile allowance assigned to the worker, which is 500 rupees per month, and allocates 6,000 for the whole year towards this mobile allowance, right? Next is the HRA, which is 20% of the cost to company, right? And 20%, then system calculates the 20% of the CTC amount and assigns it to HRA, right? So this way system distributes the overall amount which is assigned to the worker in terms of compensation basis and distributes it among all the plans which form employees compensation or which are assigned to the worker, right? And then as I mentioned, whenever we have an MBT, we need to define a variable allowance plan. Now this plan becomes your overflow allowance, which means this 100,000 rupees which system has distributed among all the plans, whatever amount is left, system will then assign it to the your special allowance. So this becomes a kind of your overflow bucket wherein the amount which is left, right, it will be allocated to this bucket, right? And that is why this is going to be a variable allowance plan. So while the first two allowance plans were created as fixed allowance plans, right, the amount could not be changed. This allowance would be a variable allowance plan, and now if you add all the totals, system gives you the 100,000, which is your total CTC, right? Now why is this called an MBT or managed basis total? Because all you're doing is you're managing the total basis amount, right? And then system automatically takes care of distributing this basis amount among all the subordinate plans, right? Okay, now how do you configure your MBT? Now this is something we have already seen. So if I go back to the task, maintain compensation basis, right, and I open any of the compensation basis, uh, let's see, uh, do I have cost to company already configured here? Oh, okay, let's look at this cost to company. Now, if you see, this cost to company is a compensation basis which is managed by basis total, right? So I'll come back. Let me go ahead and edit it. So I'll edit it. Now, how do I configure an MBT compensation basis? This is the section which allows me to define an MBT compensation basis, right? So the moment I select this checkbox, that particular compensation basis becomes managed basis total basis, right? Okay, now the moment this checkbox is enabled, system automatically highlights these other options. Now what is the first part? Salary plan maximum. Now the percentage that I assign here is the maximum percentage of your CTC in this case that will be allocated towards your salary plan. So for example, if I have defined the cost to company of a worker as 100 rupees, then the salary plan amount would be maximum of 50 rupees. So this is the maximum amount that will be allocated towards your CTC, right? Okay. All right. What is the rounding rule? These are the rules which are used to round the value. Now, we have already discussed the rounding rules in other components as well, right? For example, your merit plans, your bonus plans, and other plans. So, we already understand what is a rounding rule. So, we can assign any of the existing rules. For example, if this says round to the nearest 10, round to the nearest 1, and so on and so on. So, this basically identifies how this 50% or the 50% maximum will be rounded. So let's say your amount 50% is 450 rupees and 50 paisa. Then based on the rounding rules that you have configured, let's say it could be rounded to 450 rupees, right? Okay, now what is retained basis total? When this checkbox is selected, now let's say a given employee already is on total cost to company, right? And his CTC is 100,000 rupees. Now when you perform any of the compensation changes on the worker, let's say this employee gets promoted, right? And you initiate a change job promotion for this worker, right? As part of this change job, you'll automatically trigger the proposed compensation change business process, right? Now in this proposed compensation change business process, the employee's CTC amount of 100,000 will be retained, right? So when you select retain basis total, the present CTC or the present MBT compensation basis amount will be retained when employees compensation is changed, right? And this is what we discussed here. You manage basis total. When you select this checkbox, an employee's compensation will be managed by a basis which is an MBT basis, right? And what is the purpose? This allows Workday to basically distribute the change to compensation to all the individual plans which are assigned to the worker. Now, what is this? And we have already discussed ranking, right? And then the next part is all your different plans which will add up to give you the total value of your CTC, right? So here I've selected any salary plan assigned to the worker should be included to calculate the CTC, right? I don't want period salary plan to be included. I have only selected these specific allowance plans to be included. So if a worker is assigned an allowance which is not in this list, and let's say that allowance is 100 rupees per month or 1200 per annum, that allowance amount would not be added to the CTC total of the worker, right? Again, only your salary plans, your period salary plans, and your allowance plans form your basic salary or may form your basic salary. And that is why if you see in any of the other plans, you don't have the option of base pay only. Now, what it means is only if a given salary plan assigned to the worker is your basic salary, and we know how is it identified. It is identified based on the base compensation element assigned to the salary plan versus the compensation element assigned to the grade profile of the worker, right? So what I'm saying is only if the salary plan is the basic pay plan, then include it in your total. Similarly, only if a given allowance plan is considered as the basic pay plan, only then included in the cost to company, right? So the options are I can include all, I can include selected plans, I may exclude all the plans of that particular type, and or I may include only those plans which are considered as the basic salary plans, right? Now what is this ranking? If I open Steve Morgan's profile and go back to the compensation, so if I go ahead and open Steve Morgan's profile, right, and go to his compensation details. mm, yeah. uh, okay, I see that this employee has been assigned the primary compensation basis of total compensation. If I go to the additional actions and then to compensation and view compensation basis details, okay, and I see that Steve Morgan, he has been assigned multiple custom bases. For example, total compensation, which is at the top, and then he is also eligible for a few other bases, right? But then when I see here the ranking of why is when Steve Morgan is eligible for total compensation as well as these two other bases, on Steve Morgan's profile only total compensation is displayed, because employees compensation can only be represented in terms of one primary compensation basis, right? Now out of all these three bases, how does system know which compensation basis should be considered as his primary compensation basis? This is determined by the ranking associated with that basis. So the lower the ranking, the higher the priority. So even though Steve Morgan, he is eligible for all three bases, because the ranking of total compensation is 4, which is the least of these three rankings, system gives preference to total compensation. And where is this ranking assigned? It is assigned here. So a ranking can only be unique. So for example, if I assign it a ranking 2, it gives me an error saying that a ranking has to be unique, right? Uh, if I go to maintain compensation basis task, what you see is the ranking for total compensation is 4, whereas the ranking for that other plan is 7 and 8. And that is why system uses this as the primary compensation basis for the work. Okay, so that is the MBT. Now let's look at this in action, right? Now we have already discussed this, but let's say I have a simple requirement, right? I have the primary compensation basis of the worker, which is total CTC, right? And then the basic salary of the worker is, let's say, 50% of the CTC. PF assigned. Now this worker is also eligible for PF, which is then 12% of the basic salary. HRA is 50% of basic. LTA is 25% of HRA. And then you have a couple of allowances, or let's say a single allowance, mobile allowance, wherein managers and above gets 2000 and below managers get 1000, right? And then you have a special allowance, which is basically the overflow amount of all the remaining plans. Now how do you set this up? So the first thing that you'll have to do is specify uh, the the primary compensation basis. Now if we go back, all right, and this is my total cost to company. If I edit it, so the first thing, if you see, my basic salary is 50% of my CTC, and that is what I have configured here. I've said my salary plan maximum is 50%, right? So now my basic salary becomes 50% of my CTC, which is my compensation basis, which is what I am showing here, right? Okay, now next let's look at uh, this allowance plan, right, which is mobile allowance. Now if I go in here, I have created a mobile allowance plan, and this will be created, or this should be created as a fixed amount plan, right? Now here I'll go ahead and define those different amounts based on the eligibility criteria. So what I'm saying is, for mobile allowance, if the employee is manager in India, then he gets 2000 INRs. If the employee is non-manager in India, then it gets $1,000, 1,000 rupees, right? So now I have configured these fixed amount plans, right? What I've also done is I have configured this overflow allowance, and let's see what is this overflow allowance. Now this should be configured as a variable allowance plan, right? Now, as I mentioned, because this is your variable allowance plan, system would basically allocate all the overflow amount to this plan, right? Because this is variable allowance, system would able to change the amount associated with this plan as it sees fit. Okay, now let's look at my PF. uh, okay, what is my PF? My PF is 12% of my basic salary. My HRA is 50% of my basic salary. So how did I configure these two? So if I look at my PF allowance, now this will be set up as a percentage based plan. Now if I see here, it is 12% of my total base pay, which is my basic salary, right? And how did I set up my HRA? Again, it is going to be 50% of my total base pay, right? Okay, now LTA is 25% of my HRA. Now how do I configure this? Now for these two plans it was pretty straightforward, because there's already a basis which manages my basic salary. So if I take total base pay, it will have my basic salary, and that is why for PF and HRA I was able to base them on total base pay. But then there's no basis in which my HRA would be included. So what I've done is, if I go to my HRA plan, I have created a new basis, right? So what is my LTA? LTA is 25% of my HRA, right? So LTA again is 25% of my HRA. So if I go in here, what I've done is I have created LTA, and it is 25% of this basis. Now, what is this basis? This only includes the amount of my HRA plan. So if you see, I have this HRA plan which I have configured here, WB611 HRA. Now, whatever amount is calculated for your HRA, I have added that amount to this basis, which I'm calling as HRA as basis, and then I'm calculating my LTA as 25% of that basis, right? And then we have already calculated our mobile allowance and special allowance, right? Now, what is the priority, or what is the algorithm for calculating these values? System would first check of all the plans assigned to the worker, the fixed amount plans. If you see here, this one fixed amount plan, so system first calculates the value of the fixed amount plan, right? Next, system checks, is there any percentage based plan which is based on the primary compensation basis. Now in this case, there's no percentage based plan which is based on your CTC, except for salary plan, which will be calculated later, right? So if I say there's no other percentage based plan which is based on CTC, right? So third, system checks, are there any plans which can be calculated using the plans that are already identified above. So now if I go back, the only plan that have been identified till now are these fixed amount plans, right? Mobile allowance, right? And no plan is based on this mobile allowance, right? Next, system checks or calculates or determines the value of the salary plan. So now system will come here and determine the value of my salary plan, right? Next, system calculates the value of any other plan which are based on the plans already calculated. So now if you see my PF and HRA, it is based on my basic, which is my basic salary. So next, system will calculate these two plans, and then finally it will calculate uh, this plan, which is LTA, and then all the remaining amount gets allocated to your reminder plan, which is your overflow plan. So at the end, whatever amount is left, which is CTC minus the sum of all these plans, it will be allocated to this special allowance, right? So this is how system calculates your MBT, and this is an example of how your MBT would be calculated, right? Okay, next let's look at how your plans are rolled out. Right now, there are many scenarios wherein you want to roll out a given plan or remove a given plan from a section of employees, right? So let's say you've created a new plan, right, and you want to roll it out to a number of employees. Right now, there is a task available which is called rollout compensation plans to employees. Go back here. So this is the task: roll out compensation plans to employees. I'll specify the name of the process. I'll specify the effective date with which the plan should be rolled out. I'll specify the reason for rolling out this plan. So let's say this is some corrective adjustment or some cost of living. Then I'll select all the plans which needs to be rolled out. So I've created a few WB plans. Let's say I want to roll out these plans. So this is a allowance plan, right? And it is a fixed amount allowance plan, right? And then I can, now how do I identify to which employee these plans should be rolled out? Should I roll it out to all my employees in the entire hierarchy or structure, or let's say I only want to roll it out to India employees, or I only want to roll out this plan to my regular employees? Now I can determine that based on the eligibility criteria. So for example, I only want to roll out this plan to my India employees. I'll select the eligibility criteria, uh, country India. Now, all those employees who belong to India, this plan would automatically be rolled out to those employees, right? Or if I don't want to roll this out based on some eligibility criteria, I want to select my employees manually, I can go ahead and do that. I want to roll out this plan to, let's say, Steve Morgan. I can select Steve Morgan and roll out this plan to that employee, right? Now, when the plan is rolled out, I can specify the expected end date and the actual end date. So let's say I'm rolling out this plan from 1st of Jan 2020, and I want this plan to be removed from the employee profile as of May 31st, right? So on this date that I have selected the actual end date, system would automatically remove this plan from the employee profile, right? I can also select expected end date. Okay, I can also select expected end date. So let's say instead of actual end date, I have selected May 31st as my expected end date, right? In that case, when I run a process which is remove expected scheduled remove compensation plans with expected end date. So when I run this process, this will check all those plans which have an expected end date, right, in the past, and it will remove those plans from the employee profile, right? So this task can be used to mass roll out a, a, a bonus plan, merit plan, commission plan, allowance plans, stock plans, period salary plans, and calculated plans. So these are the plan types which can be rolled out in mass using rollout compensation plans to employees. Right. So for example, you cannot mass roll out one-time payment plans. You cannot do that for your uh, salary plans, right? Similarly to rolling out a plan, I also have the option to remove compensation plans for employees. right? Okay, now we have already discussed. So actual end date, any plan will actual end date will be automatically removed by Workday as of that date, right? Any plan which has expected end date will be removed from the employee profile when we process this report or task, right? Okay, next let's look at the embedded analytics. Now we have already seen, let me close this. We have already seen that every employee gets assigned a compensation package. Now, if I go ahead and open this compensation package, I'll see some analytics defined against that package. So if I go to the additional actions on that package, compensation package, edit compensation analytics, I have this option to edit the analytics against that package. For example, here, do I want to display the midpoint? And if I select remove this option to display the midpoint and do OK, and now refresh the screen, you'll see that the midpoint is no longer displayed, right? Again, for example, I see the range in terms of both total base pay and total compensation. Now the reason both these ranges are displayed because I have selected total primary compensation basis range as well as I have selected total base pay range. So I want to only display, for example, let's say the total base pay range, and I don't want to display total primary compensation basis range. Let me do that. And if I refresh this now, right? So now if you see only primary total base pay range is displayed and my midpoint is displayed again, right? Similarly, when I'm displaying a given range, I can also select that should my warning messages be displayed based on the total base pay range or primary basis range. For example, if I look at this employee, if I'm displaying warning messages based on, let's say, the total base pay range, then if you see the employee's total base pay is within the range, right? But then his total compensation is outside the range. So I can display warning messages based on the total base pay range or the primary compensation basis range, right? So I can design or display a number of analytics uh, based on the compensation package of the worker, right? Okay, now if I go to the additional actions and let's say compensation and request one-time payment, and let's say do okay, I see that this pop-up box opens automatically, right? Now this pop-up box is called your embedded analytics or your embedded worklets, right? Now this is configured directly on your business process. Excuse me. All right. So if I go ahead and open BP request one time payment, right? And if I go to additional actions and business process and excuse me, and maintained related workload, this is what I see. So on my request one time payment, I have configured this custom report as a worklet, which is what shows up employee base pay history, right? I can click here and for example add one more worklet or remove this existing worklet, right? What I can also configure is when the BP is opened, should it be collapsed by this by default or expanded by default. Now if you see here it is configured as expanded, and that is why when I open this it is expanded by default. This is how it looks, right? So we can configure a embedded worklet on a uh, on any business process definition, right? Okay. All right, guys, let's stop here. So I've covered the a review for 27th of March, 31st of March, and 2nd of April, right? Uh, Thank you, guys.